Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I'm with David Frank. We are discussing national political news of the day on this day following Independence Day. We want to discuss first the groundbreaking, history-making affirmative action decision. The Supreme Court majority finally struck down affirmative action, race-based affirmative action in college admissions once and for all. With the justices saying maybe it was necessary at one time, but we don't really have that kind of racism in this country anymore. We need to go to colorblind policies, and this was in the case of Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and University of North Carolina, I believe. This was actually, interesting enough, a group of Asian students who sued at least in one of the cases, and based on the fact that they did really well on their test scores and were not being admitted is in numbers that reflected those test scores. It's actually a very familiar theme in San Francisco. Lowell High School is a school which has traditionally also been based on merit and test scores, and it's a case where affirmative action has also kind of worked against some Asian students. They test really well, but they try to bring in more diversity into the school, and otherwise it would be about possibly as high as 80 or 90% Asian. Instead, this keeps it to about 40 or 50, maybe 60%. It's very interesting dynamics here, but the Supreme Court has shut it down, saying we must move beyond. It's time to move beyond this. There's a lot of arguments. There were different opinions advanced. The dissent wrote a very impassioned response. But this is it. Has been struck down. I want to discuss the decision itself and its implications, but I do want to save some time because I do believe there are actually workarounds of this, and that affirmative action can actually be preserved effectively, even though this is symbolically a horrible decision. And there were even some hints left in Roberts' opinion. But Dave, I want to turn this over to you to comment on this, because this is probably, we've had some pretty landmark decisions this year, but this is huge.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's really big time, huge significance for everybody, in part because it's forcing upon everyone the obligation, if you choose to understand what's happening, to kind of get a better understanding of how we got to this point. And so I'll be brief here, but just to say that obviously based on the lead, Supreme Court has significantly reduced the role of race in the admissions process, but that word is couched in terms of saying, well, what does that mean? But so for a lot of people that I've talked to since this happened last week, affirmative action is not the same as a quota. So that's been illegal since 1978.
That's right, and the last quotas were shut down in 2006 thereabouts. The last hint of quotas.
Yeah, exactly that. So I was going to say, for the last 50 years, it's kind of been a process where universities have to look at the whole applicant and then include race as one factor. I actually saw a graphic of this where there was a bunch of petals on a flower and race was one of them. And then the image pulled that one out and said, nope, that's no longer something you could look at. The idea is that on 14th Amendment equal protection grounds, that a university, the argument is that they are given priority to diversity on the grounds of race, but that has been discriminatory. But the defense of that is that diversity itself is actually a benefit to all of the members of the academic community, which contributes to a healthier discourse. So then this outcome is a little bit confusing because it gets rid of the specific plans in Harvard and University of North Carolina. Harvard is the oldest private institution, and University of North Carolina is one of the oldest public institutions. And so, even like you said, you hinted, not to dive away, get away from the background, but race has always been part of consideration. The question is to what extent. Roberts did mention that it can be, for example, in the personal essay. And then so how will this even be enforced? Because this only applies to 2 schools when there's, many hundreds of schools. And then so what I've gathered is that sort of on a case-by-case basis, as schools improvise and adapt their policies and believe that their policies are compliant, it'll be up to more lawsuits to challenge specific policies. But one last thing on the background. The California experience has been brought up a lot because California Prop 209 banned racial considerations affirmative action in college admissions back in 1996. Right. So there's a track record of data here, and we can talk about it a little bit more. That passed back in 96, 55-45. So it wasn't like it was overwhelming, but there has since then now that lots of data says that in fact racial diversity has been going down over time, over much of that period from 96 to present, and that even though there are other considerations, there are other sort of proxies for attaining diversity across the student body. For example, one, socioeconomic status. I'm sure we're going to talk about more, but that still doesn't fully make up for the fact that this court wants to remove race entirely as a factor.
At least certain elements of this course. Roberts again hinted at that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. That maybe it doesn't have to entirely be removed, but race by itself as a sole factor. But race combined with other factors may not be. But we'll get to that in a minute. I want to talk a bit about the legal things and the aspects of this decision. And of course, I always like to point out the hypocrisies of right-wing decisions because I'm that way. But it's there's reference to the decisions, particularly when you read Clarence Thomas's decision, and he talks about how he faced adversity, but he believes that he had a hard time getting jobs after because everybody assumed that he was an affirmative action beneficiary. His own friend, by the way, has tried to contradict him on that, says, you weren't offered any jobs before that because you weren't even there to have the opportunity to apply for jobs and be refused them. But he had applied to a lot of jobs and to elite law firms, and he carries around those letters. He actually has them in his office to this date as evidence that affirmative action harmed him. No consideration of the fact that maybe those private firms actually have their own legacy, but things that they maybe didn't hire him because he's black. Maybe they didn't hire him. I mean, did he? Does he point to evidence that other black people were hired that didn't benefit? Well, of course, all black people benefit from affirmative action, right? Well, maybe they hired, somebody's nephew, somebody's daddy, somebody who has connections, and the rest. And that's something he didn't have. He actually was an outsider the whole time. He didn't want to be part of any crew schmoozing. He wore overalls. I really recommend, there's a documentary airing right now that you can access on PBS. It's Clarence and Ginny Thomas, a very fair and balanced documentary that outlines this. He went in, he had a brief moment of radicalism after Martin Luther King was killed. He left the seminary, and so he then did not network. He just was a loner and dressed differently to show that he wasn't an elitist and the rest, and then didn't get himself hired because it's not just about your qualifications. It's about kissing up in the right way if you want to get into one of those law firms, if that's your goal. And not everybody does that. So anyway, I mean, there's a lot of politics here. But
Eric, wait, but before you dive in, I just want to add to the story, because I mean, it's something that's worth people being aware of, is that Clarence Thomas actually would carry around, I think, his diploma, or rather on the back of his diploma, he put a Chiquita banana sticker or something like that, because he said, well, the diploma. 10-cent stamp, that's what it was. Yeah, sorry, mixing stories here. But because he felt like it wasn't worth the paper it was printed on. But I think that that's a misperception. You alluded to it. I just want to underline what you said. So much of his framing of basically the stigma that gets associated with people who are the beneficiaries of in a degree of affirmative action for being admitted to a law school, for example, in this case, he's thinking, he always in the back of his mind was like, oh, they're thinking less of me. But like the last like 5 people I talked to about this agreed with exactly what you said. It's possible he was experiencing racism proper and sort of projecting that onto the racism inherent of his perception because of affirmative action. And so he's taken that now all the way to this moment. Like for him, this is like a lifetime achievement. All through the Reagan administration, he was actively, when his role in the Reagan administration was to actively fight against, racial consideration of race. But again, I think that there's a personal sort of almost a vendetta element of this, which is kind of worth mentioning.
I just really quickly want to point something out about the decisions here from a lawyer point of view, because one of the basic principles of judicial conservatism, and by judicial conservatives, I mean not in the political sense, but in the sense that you're really not supposed to make a constitutional decision if you can avoid it. You're supposed to look for other reasons so that you don't have so many constitutional decisions that you're overly impacting that area of law. There's a whole reason for it, but they completely avoided that here. When Students for Fair Admissions filed lawsuits against Harvard and UNC, claiming that they violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which of course has always been justified based on the Equal Protections Clause and the Commerce Clause. And by the time it got to the Supreme Court, you read these decisions by the conservative justices, they don't talk about the Civil Rights Act. I think that it has a brief mention, fleeting mention in the Roberts opinion, but they just talk about equal protection, equal protection, equal protection. So they're not basing it on the Civil Rights Act, as they should as judicial conservatives. They don't even want the Civil Rights Act to have any power anymore. They would love to overturn that if they could. They can't really do that, but they wanted a constitutional decision that this is to decide this. And the big question is how is this going to impact private employment? Discussion, and this is an indication that they are going to do this, that they're going to just completely bypass the Civil Rights Act. That conservatives actually these days hate the Civil Rights Act, even though it was passed by Republicans, more Republicans in the North, actually. Passed it. Democrats in the North passed it, but it was most of the opposition came from Southern Democrats. There were some conservative Republicans who opposed it too on states' rights basis and the rest, but they've already gutted the Voting Rights Act, saved a little bit of it. I think that this is an indication that they're going after the Civil Rights Act next, and this is a really important, it's just my feeling based on reading it, hardly any discussion of the Civil Rights Act, even though that was part of the original lawsuits.
And Eric, I think you hit the nail on the head. You went exactly to where I was hoping to take this, because the original Regents of University of California versus Bakke in '78, that original case in the decision written by Justice Powell, in fact, there was 2 separate findings there with different justices. So it was Powell and 4 justices, and then Powell and 4 other justices. So what they were saying is, number one, under the not that they give them priority, but I'm giving it priority. Number one, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of '64 said that they found that the diversity in the classroom is a compelling state interest, and that affirmative action in general is allowed under the Constitution. So the practical effect was that these affirmative action programs that were in place were allowed to continue virtually unchanged. So everybody attributes to Bakke, oh, well, in fact, it undid quotas. Well, quotas was a separate part of that decision. The fundamental finding was that affirmative action was an important element of the Civil Rights Act, and that in fact we do need to do that. We do need to find a way to make society a better, more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive place. And I just think that got lost in this decision, because in fact the second part was just that quotas themselves are inherently unfair. But that set up what we've been doing for the last 50 years. I almost feel like, Thomas's axe to grind, the people that were against Bakke since the Reagan administration and beyond, they were going after the Civil Rights Act element of it because they had already won on the quota aspect of it. So again, I know this sounds like inside baseball or highly technical, but like you said, that's going to be of utmost importance as we say, well, what comes next?
Thomas headed Reagan's EEOC, and he was instrumental in this. But I want to get to this because we're running out of time. But this did not outright ban race consideration. I want to be real careful on it, at least in terms of the plurality opinion. The opinion of Roberts. It said that the programs lack sufficiently focused and measurable objectives warranting the use of race. So Roberts suggested that if you have an entrance essay, and that a potential student brings up the adversity that they faced as somebody of a certain background, that can be factored in. So not just the race itself, but the adversity they experienced. In California, schools have experimented, not with entire success, of class-based, because economic class is not a suspect class. Conservatives themselves have made sure it wasn't. So you can actually discriminate on that on a rational basis rather than requiring a compelling state interest. But it hasn't been as effective. But it just needs to be fine-tuned. And there's nothing that stops you from having affirmative action in terms of your recruiting policies. You can discriminate in your recruiting policies. You just can't have your discrimination in your acceptance policies. So I'll let you have the real final word real quick because we have to close this out, and there's going to be a lot to talk about in the future. But there are some workarounds if universities are clever. But in California, they haven't been clever, and we'll talk about that another time.
There's so many Republicans running for president. Who are these people?
I'm glad you asked. Donald Trump announced he's running in November 2022. DeSantis launched on Twitter, but there were technical problems. She announced Nikki Haley said the U.S. isn't racist. Tim Scott in the race, but then his mic went out on him. The Bergen, Vivek Ramaswamy, and Larry Elder too. Chris Christie said he's like Donald Trump, but not as crazy. Hutchison claims to be the more stable version of Trump. And Mike Pence says Trump is no longer qualified. These are the only ones in which the news has come to Washington. And there may be many more, but they haven't been announced yet.
Again.
This next topic is somewhat related. It's the Republican field is more diverse than ever in terms of the presidential candidates. Ethnically speaking, it is possibly the most diverse pantheon of presidential candidates of either party. Maybe not quite. The Democrats have had a couple of runs where they've been as diverse, but I mean, they've got Tim Scott, African American, the Larry Elder, African American, Nikki Haley, and what's the other guy's name, Dave?
Ramaswamy.
Ramaswamy. I mean, they have a number of very and Francis Suarez is another one who is, and they've got a very diverse grouping. Why are they not celebrating this? Why are they not talking about how they have achieved what the Democrats claim, and that they've got such a diverse group that they have achieved the American dream and done it without having an affirmative action or the fake politics of Democrats. You would think that they'd be doing this, but they don't. They aren't doing it at all. They're dead quiet about it. In fact, it's eerie how quiet about it they are. Well, I've got several theories about it, but one of it I think it has to do with the internal politics of the Republican Party. When Pew Research Center recently asked workers about increasing diversity and equity, inclusion and efforts in the workplace, 50% of employed adults said it was a good thing, but among Republicans, 30% agreed. Now, that's not to say they think it's a bad thing. It's just most of them would say, who cares, as long as they're good workers, right? Color blindness. That's what they are advocating. So what they want to do is tout their color blindness, but they have to be careful how they do it, or they will turn off their base, because they have a base that's easily triggered, and quite frankly, they have a base that is that has a certain percentage that is more, at least, willing to entertain racism, even if it's dog whistle. I mean, that's I've said in the past that I think that one of the problems they would have with nominating any black candidate, as I believe they had with Herschel Walker in Georgia, is maybe it's only 3 or 4%, but there's a certain percentage of them that will not vote for a black candidate, period, in Georgia, maybe even more. And I think that was a handicap in Georgia. But I have another theory about it. But Dave, I want to bring this in. Why aren't they celebrating this? Why isn't this a big theme?
So I think you're onto something here, that it has to do with the internal dynamics, but I think it's a little bit more than that, because if there was just a third of the base, seems like the situation is right now, right? Trump's polling at over 50%, DeSantis close to 20%. Everybody else combined isn't enough to give DeSantis an advantage over Trump. So the political calculus is that DeSantis is deciding he's going to need to hit Trump from his right flank. So he needs to be even more opportunistic in the policy arena of what he's been doing down in Florida. So while it sounds like a set of things that are somewhat abrasive to most of the electorate, things like banning books and things like not being able to talk openly and freely about the historical elements of structural racism, or not being able to talk openly about the need for open-minded and open conversation when it comes to just the full range of gender expression and inclusion of people. Everybody's different, right? So the color blindness is one of those things that they're touting, but unfortunately their color blindness isn't in the direction of open-mindedness. It's more along the lines of like separate but equal. It's one of those things that they're saying like, oh yeah, everybody, like, we're all the same, but in fact being all the same is not the same, because people are different. So if you're not comfortable talking about the differences and incorporating the differences openly you don't have to agree with everybody. You don't have to agree with everybody's lifestyles. You don't have to see the world in the way other people see them. But if you're the grand old party, you're the Big Ten, you should be open for everybody. So they've got like the door open, air quotes, but the strategy and the tactics are about hyping, overplaying, like DeSantis, overplaying and hyping his anti-woke credentials. And by making it their brand to outflank Trump on the right, that doesn't leave a lot of room to showcase and explain the inherent intrinsic value of what a diverse set of candidates actually brings to the table.
Which I think is related to my other theory here is, if they really make a big deal and celebrate it, the fact of the matter is there's a really good chance that they're all going to be crushed, that none of them will get more than single digits. Combined, they may not even come up with more than 10%, let alone 15, maybe 20%. So if you celebrate it, and then they're all crushed with Trump coming in first, most likely, DeSantis second with, 30%, whatever, and then Pence coming in third, and then, then maybe Nikki Haley picks up her 5 or 6%, and then all the others come away with 1, 2, or 3%. Maybe Tim Scott, coming up with a sizable, single-digit chunk. it doesn't look really good, does it? Right? Okay, they all ran. So what? Anybody can run. But if you got to tout something, you got to tout the actual support you get within the party. And they're probably seeing the writing on the wall that, hey, we've got Trump. You either support him or you don't. And then you got one of the other, guys who are likely to challenge him. Probably DeSantis is still the main person at the moment. And who else after that?
Right. And just to kind of say, okay, I talked with you about sort of what Republicans' brand is and how they're not going to go off brand. I think it's important to explore, like, what are some of the critiques of the Democratic Party? And because that critique is not just coming from Republicans or independents, that critique is actually coming from inside the House too. So there are progressive or sort of outside the corporate, outside the establishment Democrats out there who are highly critical of how, and I don't mean to be controversial and I don't mean to be provocative, but the truth is that if you say we are going to make sure that this particular seat is this particular gender or this particular race, that is not always saying we're going to pick the best candidate. You can pick the best whether you're doing appointments or whether you're doing in a primary season. If you don't mention the gender and you don't mention the race, but you still go through and appoint, for example, like if here in California, if Dianne Feinstein did have to step down and Gavin Newsom did put forward Barbara Lee, and he said, I put forward the best person for this job. The fact that Barbara Lee is a woman and the fact that she's black, he promised he would do that. So he's kind of boxed himself into that corner. If he didn't project that was his goal, and he just said, we're going to put forward the best people, we're going to consider everybody on the merits, and then he put forward Barbara Lee, you would accomplish a lot more. And so I guess that, to me, I don't know if I'm actually spelling it out properly, but I think the Republicans are what they're trying to do is say, you know what, we might make fill in the blank, Nikki Haley, the vice president. But we're not going to say, well, you know what, we really need an ethnically diverse female in that spot. They're not going to say it because it's off brand.
Yeah, but they can still celebrate. They're about to have this debate, and they're going to have the most colorful debate in their history. Why not celebrate that? Why not say, look at how far we've progressed? But again, like Suarez, I think he's going to be crushed. I think he did himself in with his statement, very first statement. 1 out of every 5 Americans today is Hispanic, Suarez said in a statement. 2/3 of America is my age or younger. We're going to need a bigger tent. Bigger tent. That's not what most Republicans want to hear. He just dog whistled himself out of any chance, as far as I'm concerned, by saying that. That'll be used against him. Whereas Elder might have a chance, could possibly have a chance, maybe not this time around, but the GOP is a party of ideas. It's not a party of identities. That's the right thing to say. That's along with what they have to say. Ramaswamy considers himself a non-white nationalist, right? He has said that, and then attacked the Democrats. I mean, that's about as far as they get. Nikki Haley's already gotten a little bit of trouble because she says, I'm a Christian, but I look to my cultural roots in Hinduism, my Hindu cultural roots. And a lot of Christians, no, you don't do that. Hinduism is Satanism, right? Anything that's not any religion that's not Christianity is Satanism. She's already in trouble for that. That's probably already cost her a bunch of votes. So it's just, you can't, you're in dangerous territory. You've still got, yes, you've got all these figures, but you still have a very white party. That's what they've invested in. They have not invested in diversity. You're going to find people that get in because it's a big enough party, obviously, that they're going to attempt to that they're going to attract people. And obviously, if somebody steps up, they're going to provide some support for them and brag about it. But it's just amazing that you've got all these people of color running. And they're just, RNC is just mum.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at the types of things that get discussed when they do these breakout groups, like there's CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, and then there's like Focus on the Family. I'm calling them breakout groups, but they're events, they're little mini conventions of like-minded folks where they're trying to stoke the base of the activist base, and to a certain extent, I think they're trying to network their bench of future lower office level seekers, and it's like a team building skill. I know I say team building all the time, but they're catering, at least over the last, during the Trump administration. I know it's been a few years now, but they're about to ramp up to this again, and they're about to start having these events again leading up to the 2024 cycle. And just the type of like you said, dog whistle, but just one of them, I just remember there was one of these CPAC events where there was like people in the crowd doing white nationalist, hand signs to the stage. Or there's actually one of the stages itself was a ruin. It was in the shape of some ruin, which is a symbol that has meaning for white nationalist groups. And so the signaling, I think the signaling to the people that they think are going to be that base, those activists, the ones that are going to have the energy and drive the turnout, because Republicans are, they run the majority of the counties in America and half the states, and so they don't really see it as that they needed to learn anything from the other party, that there's a benefit to really just engaging people on the idea that America is changing, and instead they're I'm not going to go so far as to say white grievance, but there is a sort of a nostalgia for changing a little bit more slowly.
Well, and former Representative Will Hurd, who's like the latest entrant in, he was asked, well, what about the record number of Republicans of color like you who are running? And he says, I can't articulate what the compare and contrast is. And everybody's like, what? What does that even mean? I mean, this is, they just don't know what to say about it. They can't celebrate it. They don't want to downplay it, right? They don't want to say it's nothing. But Suarez is the only one who's saying anything, and he is kind of mooted. It's amazing how this is happening. And you just think it wouldn't be that controversial for the RNC to say, hey, look, we got this interesting group of people. We've got some diversity here. But they can't even do that because as you said, the anti-woke white grievance politics are so profound is because even that would be a turnoff. And they risk, that is not consistent with MAGA politics. And certainly, people who want to go back to the 1950s or whatever was the ideal, except for the taxes of the time, everything else. But they just, I just wanted to comment on it because I think here's Lanchi Chen, a Republican of color who served as policy advisor to Mitt Romney. I think it's meaningful. It's one of those things you look at, you say, hey, that's pretty cool. That's about it.
So Romney's the guy that actually had the book of female potential appointees that someone had to carry around and bring and present. So it's like, oh, by the way, remember we need to consider women that we can appoint too. They had a binder. They needed a binder, So it just shows instead of just being let's think of all the people, it's wait, we got a binder of some other people, those other people called women.
Final segment, the Senate. Senate battle once again. And once again, it always seems to be the case that the Democrats have a lousy map. Well, I believe that is basically how the Senate is structured. It is structured against quote unquote majoritarian mob rule politics. So, when you have the same number of senators in a state like Wyoming as you do in California, it puts the Democrats in perennial disadvantage. That's just the way it is. And 2024 is going to be one of the worst maps ever for them. And they are holding on to, they have 51 members right now. They can only afford to lose one. Well, actually, they can. No, right. If they lose one, then it's then it's 50, and then a tiebreaker, assuming Biden wins. So we're looking at the vulnerable, the most vulnerable districts, and there really doesn't seem to be. We'll talk about it a little bit. Are there any chances? There seem to be 8 chances for a Republican turnover. I would say 5 reasonable chances, and I would say 3 really good chances, and I would say 1 almost inevitable chance of Republican turning over. Democrats have 2 possibilities, but things would have to really go bad for the Republicans in those 2 states. So we'll talk about them all. But before we get into the nitty gritty, because we got a lot to move through, I count 10 possibilities, but some are much more likely than others. You want to comment, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I came up with 9, so we're probably talking the same states. And I think that just big picture, which I think is worth mentioning, besides what you said, it's 51-49. They've got 1 to lose plus the Sinema factor. So Sinema's a little bit of an outlier. We'll talk about her when we get to Arizona. But just as a general trend, like what's the weather look like? This past election, presidential cycle 2020, only Maine Senate seat, Susan Collins, differed from the presidential outcome in that state. So presidential coattails are a very important consideration. And the corollary to that is that split ticket voting is in decline. So let's contrast that to 2012. In 2012, there were 6 states with a split ticket where people would vote for one party for the president and a different party for the senator. So people were a little bit less polarized. Now with our polarization, it's much, much harder to imagine a scenario where, for example, if Biden gets a great turnout, that also Democratic states aren't going to also get a wave of Democrats, or vice versa. If Trump gets a great turnout, then Republican-leaning states are going to get a great Republican turnout. And I think that's either way you cut it, we're probably looking at a changed Senate. Not to cut to the conclusion before we go through the details, but it doesn't look good.
Doesn't look good for him. I'm thinking the inevitable change, my number 1, is West Virginia. I just don't see how Manchin holds on to it. First of all, he doesn't have a lot of energy behind him from Democrats. They don't like him, not even in West Virginia. He's just, but it's hard. He's had a real difficult balance, of how do you energize the Democratic base but have a chance to win in probably one of the most, I don't even want to say conservative, but working class red MAGA states that there are and have been for a long time. Kind of ironic, because in 1988, it was one of the 8 states that went to caucus. Coal mining used to be strong union, and back when the Democrats understood class politics and stuck with it, they were a strong state, even when most of the rest of the South had turned red. But they have lost that, partly because coal has been, creating acid rain and leading to climate change, such that the Democrats and much of the left is, saying we probably need to put an end to that industry, and maybe not advocating conversion enough. But at any rate, Joe Manchin is in a lot of trouble. Very popular Governor Jim Justice is running, I believe, and it seems, I think the last poll I saw was like 30 points or something. Manchin, is trying to be a hero by standing up and opposing Biden. He did end up coming around to support the one change because it actually led to some money being spent in West Virginia, but it just doesn't seem to be helping him at this point. So barring some type of major scandal affecting Jim Justice, I just don't see how Manchin survives.
And I'm just going to be real quick and agree with just about everything that you said. Biden lost to Trump in West Virginia by 42 points. So that's confirming your trend on West Virginia. And with respect to Manchin personally, Justice, the current governor, he, depending on what poll you're looking at, Manchin's currently down by 22 points. I know it's early, but that's like almost an insurmountable challenge for him. Doesn't have a lot of wiggle room there whatsoever.
All right, but here's where I'm going to differ to you. My number 2 state is Montana. I actually think, this was my prediction, I think in either the last show or the show before it, I actually think Tester's going to weather this out. For one thing, he is tough. He's already raised $5 million in the first quarter. He is a farmer, roots, and even though there's less of a trend of people voting 2 ways, there are a lot of people who vote Republican and Independent who like him. He is loved there, and the Republicans, I think, picked somebody who looks good and might be good in a different sort of state. They picked a military hero who can bankroll his own, who's a millionaire, can bankroll his own campaign, and it looks like, but he might actually end up in a pretty rough primary against somebody who is a little bit resentful of this. He hasn't been in Montana long. Montana is very provincial about this type of thing. They don't like carpetbaggers. I actually think Jon Tester's going to hang on here, and that's a very important one. I think the Republicans have made a mistake. Again, I understand all of the demographics and the politics, and that that Trump is going to probably bring it all out. But Montana has got a lot of things. A large Native population. When they get motivated, they turn out and vote. I don't think the Tester is going to lose in 2024, but I've already made that prediction.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned this last week, and that was food for thought for me, because as I contemplated what I thought about Jon Tester's plight, I actually don't disagree with you on this one. He like you said, he's popular, he's a farmer, and the Republicans, their mix of candidates, Matt Rosendale, who Tester beat last time by about 3 points. So Tester doesn't even need half the vote because he actually won with less than half the vote last time. So it can be really close. But Rosendale is going to take some shots at Tim Sheehy in this one, and so that's going to be rough up the race a little bit more. So I do see Tester holding on here.
All right, let's try to move quickly. Ohio. I also think Sherrod Brown. They've thrown money at him in 2012. The most dark money of anybody besides Obama was thrown against him. They keep writing him off, and yet he survives time and time again. On the other hand, J.D. Vance, not a very good candidate, defeated Tim Ryan, who was even more conservative than Sherrod Brown and a good candidate who ran a good campaign and still won. But Sherrod Brown, they keep writing him off, and yet he's won, I think, 2 or 3 times now, about 3 times, I think. Again, it's Ohio. Ohio has become very red, but I don't write Sherrod Brown off. I don't give him as much of a chance as Tester, but I would still say that it's at least 50-50.
So it's a very close race, obviously too close for us to know. It's between 1 and 3 points, depending on which Republican candidate wins, whether it's the Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, who's an outsider, or the 2 other folks, Matt Dolan or Bernie Moreno. I think that Moreno, if he's able to win, then it's going to be a trumper against Sherrod Brown. He has a little bit better of a chance. But if Matt Dolan, State Senator Matt Dolan wins, then it's going to be very difficult for Sherrod Brown to hold on. I don't think he can.
All right. Arizona, everybody thought that Kyrsten Sinema running third party was going to draw from the Democrats, but the polling so far seems to suggest she's actually drawing from the Republicans. And the polls, I've seen 3 polls so far. Ruben Gallego, the Democrat who was going to challenge her in the primary, comes out ahead in all of them so far. Unless the dynamics change, I don't see the Republicans taking this, and I think that Sinema may actually hurt rather than help their chances.
Yep. This is an interesting one because Sinema is so alienating at this point. She lost her support from independents. and Democrats. And Ruben Gallego obviously is a very strong candidate. He just needs to convince people that he's more centrist than maybe he's come across so far, if he wants to broaden his tent. But here, the wild card here, which I don't think you mentioned, but Carrie Lake. So Carrie Lake is very polarizing. She's an election conspiracy fringe person who just lost the governor's race, still has been, talking up a storm about how it was stolen from her. I think she's going to really mess up the Republican race to the point where it'll give Gallego a lane to displace Sinema.
All right, Nevada, Jackie Rawson is being challenged. Nevada's always close, but I keep predicting that the Democrats are going to lose the Senate in that race, and I'm going to stop predicting that because the Democrats hold on every time. So I don't know the politics that way. They're talking about Laxalt running again, but I think the Democrats seem to be doing better each time, and they seem to have their act together, even though it was coming apart before. So I don't see. It can happen if it's a real bad Democratic year, but so far it doesn't look like it's going to be. I think the economy will probably be, if there is a recession, will probably be improving. So, it can happen, but I would lean Jackie Rawson holding on.
Yeah, and then polling says she's doing really well, and so we'll see. The current seat was flipped from Republican to Democrat, and re-election occurred. So it's one of those things where the state is drifting towards lean Democrat, and it's kind of it looks like it's all going to play out well for Jackie Rose, an incumbent.
Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin. Again, Wisconsin can be a conservative place. I mean, the incumbent Republican held on, even though it was a bad candidate last time around against a pretty good Republican candidate, Democratic candidate. But this last Supreme Court election, where the Democrats won in an off-year election, tells me that Baldwin is going to hold on unless she really messes up.
Yeah, I'm with you. The overall climate there is trending again towards Tammy Baldwin, and right now it's within 1%, but it should play out to Tammy Baldwin's favor.
Same thing, Stabenow. Michigan has gone blue, blue, blue. I don't see that as a problem at all.
I'm with you. And interesting, we're talking about Wisconsin, Michigan. I don't know if we said Pennsylvania yet, but
Bob Casey, I'm going to predict he holds on too.
Yeah. And Bob Casey's ahead by a lot. He's an institution. His dad was a former governor. He's going against somebody who was already in the mix in the Republican primary last time. So Bob Casey's actually in the strongest position here, besides anybody we've talked to, I think.
All right, but if any, we know that West Virginia is probably going to fall. So if any one of those others falls, just because of bad luck, one of the guys gets caught with a pecker in their pocket or out of their pocket or something like that, it's bad news for the Democrats. So can the Democrats pick up? Well, we've got Texas and Florida as outside chances, possibilities. Ted Cruz is a perennially bad candidate, but he keeps winning, and we keep hoping, those of us who are on the Democratic side, for this, flip in Texas that we keep hoping for, but it never happens. It comes within single digits every time. But is there a chance that Ted Cruz is going to be taken out?
So we got the same two states, Texas and Florida. And with respect to Texas, I think you're right about your characterization of Cruz. He's a historically unlikable candidate. The state is trending a little bit slowly but surely, demographically, et cetera, towards a centrist area. But the key thing here is that the Democrats have a recruit, Representative Colin Allred, who charismatic former NFL player, went to Berkeley Law, worked in the Obama administration with Lillian Castro in housing and urban development, was a private litigator at Perkins Coie for voting rights. Like, great resume, great candidate, and can conceivably really hit hard against Cruz. And I think there's a potential there, but I wouldn't predict it. But it's going to be really interesting.
Better than O'Rourke, you think?
Yeah, because Beto disqualified himself by saying we're coming to your house and taking your guns. That was like the dumbest thing anybody could ever say in Texas.
How about Rick Scott? They don't seem to have a major candidate yet, but they've had a few, Deming's possibilities, any chance of taking him out, because he hasn't always been the best candidate. And Florida, has been Republican recently, but there's a lot of disenchantment around DeSantis and the Republicans. Is that a possibility?
I would say like 9 times out of 10, if you ask me that question, I would say anything's possible. Rick Scott is pretty awful. He's kind of like there's a long list of things you could say about him, but even amongst his own party, his plan to win back the Senate that he did last time included some things that Republicans are like, why did you even consider putting these things in there? You obviously
Medicare and Social Security.
Yeah, it was a bunch of stuff. Like he couldn't read the room. He's just a not a great politician, I don't think. But that said, it's not time yet. Florida's in a weird post-COVID anti-establishment mode, and for whatever reason, the Republicans are benefiting immensely down there, and I think Rick Scott's going to hold on.
Yeah, until the DeSantis collapse actually happens, and that may lead to some kind of fallouts within the Republican Party, and the Democrats just don't have it together down there. But I do think that the Democrats could run the inside straight and win everything except West Virginia and hold on to that narrow majority again.
Eeny, meeny, chili beanie, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
All right, this brings us to our predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
I was conspicuously quiet on your last comment there because I'm just going to jump right into it. I think, unfortunately, it's impossible, nearly impossible, for that royal straight flush to be dealt in this 5-card poker game of politics here, that the Democrats can't keep West Virginia, that can't keep Ohio, and so it just doesn't seem reasonable. And then if what I think is true, that the country pushes against Biden, and there's a little bit of a Republican surge, then that could hurt some of these other candidates even also down the line.
If there is, although I think I think you're wrong about Ohio, but we'll see. All right, I am going to make a prediction. I know it's early. Everybody says it's too early to write DeSantis off, but I'm writing DeSantis off. There was an ad that came out. It wasn't even his ad. They just retweeted it or whatever. But it was an ad that was intended to be homophobic. But as Pete Buttigieg's husband said, it's totally gay. It was just it's an amazing thing. DeSantis, I just don't think he has. I think he's the factors for him in Florida, for him to win even by 20 points in Florida. We're lucky that the Democrats don't have it together down there, that there's structural benefits for him down there, but he is not ready for national prime time. And I just don't think he has what it takes to take on Trump. Maybe somebody else will have to step in, but I am writing off DeSantis's campaign. I know it's only July, but I do not think that DeSantis will be the Republican nominee or the next president.
He's a one-trick pony, and the tricks run old. It's getting stale.
Until then, we'll be discussing this in the future. Could be wrong, but until then, till next time, stay informed and stay engaged.